Heath Novak had spent 15 years proving that sentiment was a liability. He'd said it once at a business conference in downtown Toronto, casually, the way someone mentions the weather, and it had been quoted in 3 industry publications by the following Monday. He hadn't minded. It was true, after all. Sentiment built nothing. Capital built things. Steel and glass and the patient accumulation of leverage. That was what reshaped skylines. That was what mattered. At 41, Heath ran Novak Development Group from the 32nd floor of a glass tower on Bay Street that his own firm had erected a decade ago. He was the kind of man other men studied from a distance. His tailored suits, his unhurried posture, the way he had of pausing before he spoke that made every room quieter. He had never needed to raise his voice to be the most powerful person in it. None of which explained why he was standing at a charity gala on a Thursday evening in November, listening to his oldest friend suggest that he couldn't manage a simple conversation with a woman who didn't like him. "She doesn't just not like you," Scott Renner said, refreshing his whiskey at the bar. Scott was a real estate lawyer who had known Heath since their undergrad days at Queen's, and had therefore earned the unique privilege of saying exactly what he thought. "She's testified against 3 of your projects at City Council this year alone. She wrote a piece in the Globe calling your Parkdale development, and I'm quoting, a masterclass in civic indifference." "I read it," Heath said. "Then you know she's not exactly charmed by your reputation." "Nobody writes something like that because they're indifferent," Heath said. "She's paying attention. That's different." Scott set his glass down. He had a way of smiling that meant trouble, and Heath recognized it too late. "All right. I'll bet you this. 1 month. Spend 1 month genuinely engaging with her, her work, her world, not yours. No donations made in her name, no pulling strings from behind the scenes. And if at the end of it she still thinks you're exactly the man she wrote about in that piece, you settle the Glendale file my way." The Glendale file was a property dispute that Heath had been winning, slowly and expensively, for 2 years. He opened his mouth. "And if she changes her mind," Scott said, "I'll sign over my stake in the Riverside project." The Riverside stake was worth considerably more than the Glendale dispute. Heath looked at his friend for a long moment. "What's her name?" "Delphine Bouchard." Heath reached for his own drink. "Fine." He found her at a community town hall meeting 3 days later, in the basement of a church on Roncesvalles Avenue. She was at the front of the room, not behind a podium but standing beside one, speaking without notes to about 60 people, seated in plastic chairs. The fluorescent lights were the unflattering kind. She didn't seem to notice. Delphine Bouchard was 31 years old, with dark hair pulled into a loose knot and the sort of directness in her face that Heath usually associated with people who had spent years being told no. She was explaining to a room full of residents from a block his company had purchased the year before exactly what their legal rights were if they received an eviction notice. She knew the municipal bylaws the way Heath knew balance sheets, not recited but inhabited. He stood at the back. Nobody paid him any particular attention, which was itself unusual enough to register. Afterwards, when the chairs were being stacked and the last residents were drifting toward the exit, Heath walked to the front of the room. Delphine was packing papers into a canvas bag. She looked up before he reached her, assessed him in one quick, practiced glance, and said, "You're Heath Novak." "I am," he said. "The sign-in sheet is by the door," she said, and went back to her bag. It was so efficiently dismissive that he nearly laughed. "I'm not here to sign in. I wanted to introduce myself." "You just did." She zipped the bag closed. "I know who you are, Mr. Novak. I know what your company owns on this block, and I know what your development plans look like for the next 18 months. Is there something specific you wanted to say, or were you hoping the introduction would be enough?" Heath had not been spoken to like that since his 2nd year of business school. He found, to his mild surprise, that he didn't particularly mind. "You're well prepared," he said. "That's my job," she said. "I thought your job was community advocacy." "Same thing." She picked up her bag and looked at him directly. There was no hostility in it, exactly. It was something more precise than hostility, the look of someone who has decided not to waste energy on performed emotion. "Is there something I can help you with?" Heath had prepared 3 opening lines on the drive over. None of them felt usable anymore. "I'd like to understand your concerns about the Parkdale project," he said, which was the closest to honest of anything he'd planned to say. "Not as a negotiation. I'd like to understand them." Delphine studied him for a moment with the same expression she might have given a document she wasn't sure she could trust. "All right," she said finally. "You can come to our community breakfast on Saturday, 7:30, St. Anne's Hall. Bring your own coffee. We're not catering to Bay Street hours." He brought his own coffee. He arrived at 7:20. The breakfast was exactly what it appeared to be: volunteers, folding tables, donated muffins, and about 40 residents who were dealing with one housing crisis or another. Heath had been to events that raised 7 figures for similar causes. He had never sat in the room where the causes lived. Delphine moved through it with an ease that was clearly the result of years of being genuinely needed in a place. She knew people's names, their children's names, the details of their cases. She remembered. Not as a performance but as a reflex, the way a person remembers the things that matter. Heath sat where he was directed, listened more than he spoke, and by 10 o'clock had helped a retired postal worker named Marcel navigate the city's appeals process for a rent increase dispute. He had not done it as a gesture. He had done it because Marcel had been there for 2 hours and hadn't known who else to ask. On the way out, Delphine caught up to him on the steps. "You didn't embarrass yourself," she said. "High praise," he said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "It was," she said, and walked back inside. They fell into a strange rhythm over the following weeks. Not friendship, not quite, but something that required a name neither of them reached for. Heath began attending the events Delphine organized. A tenants' rights workshop, a meeting with city councilors about the inclusionary zoning policy, a freezing Thursday afternoon when volunteers handed out winter coats in Kensington Market. He wore a coat he'd owned for years, not the new one from the Eaton Center he'd almost bought specifically for the occasion. He learned things he hadn't known he didn't know. He learned that 2 of the families displaced by the Parkdale project had been on that block for over 30 years. That 3 children had changed schools as a result of the relocation. That the affordable replacement units promised in the city approval process had been built with a ceiling height that technically qualified but practically discouraged families with children. He had signed those plans. He had not read them the way Delphine now described them. She wasn't cruel about it. That was what unsettled him most. She didn't need to be. She just said what was true in the same clear, unhurried way she'd used in that church basement on Roncesvalles, and the truth was uncomfortable enough without any added sharpness. "You're not what I expected," he said one evening. They were walking back from a city hall session that had run 2 hours long. The temperature had dropped, and their breath came in small clouds. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone angrier." Delphine tucked her hands deeper into her pockets. "Anger is expensive," she said. "I can't afford it." He didn't ask what she meant. He thought he understood, but he was beginning to realize that with Delphine, understanding the words and understanding what was underneath them were 2 separate projects. There were moments when she looked at him in a way that felt off-register, a half-second where something behind her eyes went quiet and careful, the way a person goes quiet when they are deciding something. He noticed it and said nothing. The same way he'd learned in 15 years of negotiation that the most useful move is sometimes to wait. The month was almost over when she said it. They were at her office, a rented room in a shared nonprofit space in the Junction, walls pinned with maps and council meeting agendas, and the kind of handwritten notes that accumulate in a place where one person is doing the work of 3. Heath had stopped in to drop off some zoning documents she'd requested, and stayed longer than he'd intended. They'd been talking about the city's new housing plan, and then they hadn't been, and the room had gone to a different kind of quiet. "You think you've been doing something generous," Delphine said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the window, which faced a brick wall. "These weeks, showing up." "I don't know what I've been doing," Heath said, which was honestly the truest thing he'd said in a long time. "Yes, you do." She turned then, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen before, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has decided at last to put it down. "You just don't know all of it yet." She paused. "My father's name was Bernard Bouchard. He ran a small contracting company out of Hamilton. 12 employees, 23 years into business. In 2018, your firm was the lead developer on the Lakeview project. The general contracting bid went to a company called Meridian Group. She said the name the way people say the name of a thing they have thought about for years. Bernard had bid on that contract. His company was the lowest qualified bid by a significant margin. Heath had gone still. What happened after the contract was awarded, Delphine continued, was that Meridian began subcontracting work to smaller outfits at rates that undercut the market. My father lost 2 of his biggest long-term clients that year because they couldn't compete with those rates. He lost the 3rd the following spring. He tried to restructure. He took out a second mortgage on the house. She stopped, breathed once, evenly. He had a heart attack in January of 2020. He was 63. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. I didn't know about the subcontracting arrangement, Heath said. I know you didn't, Delphine said. I've read every document that's publicly available about that project. Your name isn't on the subcontracting decisions. That's what makes it worse, actually. Nobody made one big decision. Everybody made a dozen small ones, and nobody ever had to look at what they added up to. She looked at him steadily. I'm not telling you this to blame you for his death. He had a weak heart. That's not your fault. A pause. But it's also not nothing. Heath found that he had no sentence that was adequate. He sat with that. I need to tell you the rest, Delphine said, because I've been deciding for 3 weeks whether to, and I think not telling you would be its own kind of dishonesty. She sat down across from him, the desk between them. The year my father died, I had been accepted into the urban planning graduate program at UBC. Full funding. It was, she stopped. Started again. It was the thing I'd been working toward for 6 years. My mother was in no condition to manage alone. The mortgage was in default. There was nobody else. She folded her hands on the desk. I deferred once, then I withdrew. Heath understood then the full weight of what he was sitting across from. Not just grief, but the specific theft of a future that had been within reach and then wasn't. And the particular way a person learns to carry that without collapsing, because collapsing is a luxury that circumstances don't always permit. I agreed to this. He stopped. He had not told her about the bet. He looked at her and saw in her expression that she had known, possibly for some time. Scott Renner told a mutual acquaintance, she said simply. I found out the 2nd week. A breath. I kept going anyway. Because whatever your reason for showing up was, the people at those meetings still needed someone to show up. And because, she stopped again, because I wanted to know if the version of you I was starting to see was real, or if it was just what a person looks like when they're trying to win something. Heath said nothing for a long time. Then, I'm sorry for the bet, for I'm sorry. I know, she said, and she sounded not forgiving exactly, but open, as if forgiveness were a country she was standing at the border of, not yet across. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in his apartment on the 34th floor and looked at the city he had helped build, and thought about all the things he hadn't read carefully enough. By morning he had made 3 decisions. The first was that he would go through every project Novak Development Group had undertaken in the past decade and identify every community displacement the firm had contributed to, directly or indirectly. Not for a press release, not for optics, for a list, something that could actually be looked at. The second was that he would call Meridian Group's former CEO, a man Heath had dealt with twice, pleasantly, over golf, and find out exactly how the subcontracting arrangement on the Lakeview project had been structured and who had benefited from it. The third was that he would fund the community housing initiative that Delphine had been trying to get off the ground for 2 years, not as a donation to her organization, but as a designated fund controlled entirely by a resident-led board that she would help establish. He wouldn't sit on the board. He wouldn't put his name on the building. He made the first call at 8 in the morning. The list took 6 weeks to compile. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't update Delphine on his progress. He showed up at the breakfast on Saturday, and the town hall on Wednesday, and the freezing coat drive in Kensington Market. And he didn't explain why he kept coming back. Because she hadn't asked, and he didn't think the explanation was the point. But she noticed. He could tell she noticed, because she stopped going quiet and careful when she looked at him. She stopped deciding something in those half-second pauses. Whatever she'd been waiting to see, she was beginning to believe she was seeing it. It was a Saturday afternoon in February, a bitter one, the kind that blows in off Lake Ontario with personal grievance, when Delphine stopped him on the steps of the community center after a tenants' meeting and said, without preamble, "The housing fund, I know it was you." He hadn't tried to hide it, he just hadn't announced it. "The board controls the fund," he said, "not me." "I know." She pulled her scarf tighter. Her eyes were bright from the cold. "That's why I know it was real." A pause. "I also know about the calls you made to families from the Parkdale block. Martha Chen told me last week. She said you helped her get her daughters back into their old school district." "The transfer wasn't complicated," he said. "It just needed someone to push on it." Delphine looked at him for a long moment. The wind off the lake pressed hard against the space between them. "You can't fix everything you broke," she said. "I know," he said. "But you're trying to fix what you can." "Yes." She looked away, toward the street, where a delivery truck was trying unsuccessfully to parallel park. When she looked back, the border was closer. He could feel it. "I'm not in the same place I was 3 months ago," she said carefully, "with any of this." "Neither am I," Heath said. She nodded once, slowly. "I know." And then, in a tone that was not an invitation but was not a closed door either, "There's a planning commission meeting Thursday. It's about the new affordable housing bylaw. I could use a second set of eyes on the proposal before I present." He kept his voice even. "What time?" 6:30, she said. "Bring your own coffee." Spring came slowly to Toronto that year, the way it always does. 2 weeks of false starts and one cold snap that catches everyone off guard in April. But it came. The Housing Fund approved its first 3 projects in March. At the press conference, which Delphine ran, alongside 3 members of the resident board, Heath stood at the back of the room again, the same way he'd stood at the back of the church basement on Roncesvalles in November. Nobody was photographing him. He found he preferred it. He and Delphine were not a story anyone would have written as probable. They were careful with each other in ways that felt earned rather than cautious. The difference between going slowly because you're afraid and going slowly because you understand that some things break if you rush them. There were dinners, then walks, then the particular domesticity of 2 people who have decided to stop pretending they don't want each other's company. One evening in May, she told him that the urban planning program at UBC had a part-time cohort designed for working professionals, and that she had put in an inquiry. She said it without drama, in the same practical tone she used for everything that mattered. Heath said that sounded right and meant it, and didn't offer to pay for it because she hadn't asked and wouldn't. 2 weeks later, she told him she'd been accepted. He took her to dinner at a place in Leslieville that she'd mentioned once, months ago, in passing. A detail he'd kept the same way she kept the details of the people in those plastic chairs. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it directly. She just smiled, the real one, the one she kept for things that had earned it. "I have a question," she said over dessert. "All right," he said. "The bet with Scott, the Riverside stake." She tilted her head slightly. "Did you win it?" Heath thought about it seriously. He thought about the list of names he'd compiled, the calls he'd made, the Thursday evenings in a rented room in the Junction, talking about zoning policy and becoming, gradually, someone he recognized more easily than the man who'd stood on that gala floor in November calculating leverage. He thought about what it had cost him to become that person, and what it was worth, and whether winning and losing were even the right categories. "I'm not sure the bet was the thing that mattered," he said. Delphine watched him across the table. "No," she agreed, "it wasn't." Outside, the May evening was mild enough to walk. They did. The city moved around them. The particular noise of Toronto on a warm night, all languages and transit and the lake somewhere at the end of every southbound street. Heath had walked these blocks 1,000 times in his life and never quite felt them the way he felt them now. "I want to keep doing this," he said, not a question exactly. "I know," Delphine said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him sideways. "It's a we'll see," she said, "which from me is considerable." He knew her well enough by then to know she was right. And he knew himself well enough finally to understand that considerable was exactly enough to build something real on. If you were willing to do the work, And pay attention, and stop mistaking control for strength. He was willing. He had learned, late and at a cost he hadn't been the one to pay, but he had learned. They kept walking south toward the lake. If you've ever had to choose between holding on to your pain and choosing your future, you know how hard that moment really is. Was Delphine right to give Heath that chance? Tell us what you think in the comments below. We read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Inspiring Stories. There are more waiting for you.